I'm John Scott in for Shepard Smith, and moments ago, Press Secretary Sarah Sanders announcing the White House is looking at revoking security clearances of some high-profile critics of the president. Just one of the headlines out of today's briefing. Also, President Trump and the Iranian president exchanging threats as both leaders step up the war of words against one another. The president threatened the Iranian leader via Twitter with historic consequences after President Hassan Rouhani said America should know war with Iran is the mother of all wars. That comment came after Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called Iran's leaders hypocritical holy men, accusing them of getting rich while their people suffer. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear deal in May and is reimposing economic punishments. The White House weighing in on the back and forth moments ago.
The president's been, I think, pretty strong since day one in his language towards Iran. He was responding to comments made from them.
Here's a live look at the White House. We are expecting to hear from President Trump a few minutes from now as he showcases American-made products. We will take you there live once it begins. First, though, to White House correspondent Kevin Corke, who is live in the briefing room. We heard you get the first question there. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders also talking about removing security clearances from some former intel officials, Kevin.
Yeah, Messrs. Comey, Clapper, and Brennan. Very interesting to hear her sort of float this idea. John, she really talked about the notion that the administration is merely investigating its options. It is clear to you and to me and to all of the American people that each of those gentlemen has had very public differences with the President of the United States. Here's the White House press secretary describing what the White House is looking into.
Not only is the president looking to take away Brennan's security clearance, he's also looking into the clearances of Comey, Clapper, Hayden, Rice, and McCabe. The president is exploring the mechanisms to remove security clearance because they've politicized and in some cases monetized their public service and security clearances. Making baseless accusations of improper contact with Russia or being influenced by Russia against the president is extremely inappropriate, and the fact that people with security clearances are making these baseless charges provides inappropriate legitimacy to accusations with zero evidence. Yeah.
So you heard him mention, you heard her, that is, mention a couple of other names there, Rice, McCabe, and others. What's interesting here, John, is Sarah Sanders is talking about the notion of politicizing and monetizing the information that they have. That's information they still have access to, and that's the real question for the American people. Should they, in particular, have access if they're still going out there making very strong political statements in opposition to the sitting president of the United States, John?
Yeah, I think a lot of people might be surprised to know that you can still keep that access when you leave the office. What about the back and forth with Iran? What's the latest on that?
Well, this is interesting, too, because, look, you and I have talked about this on a number of occasions. The president has been very forceful in his opinion about the Iranian leadership. The White House is sort of in a coordinated effort right now, John, where they're talking about supporting the Iranian people, but also being very strong in their opposition to the Iranian leadership. Sarah Sanders talked about it. The president, obviously, very forceful on Twitter, which we've been talking about all day long here on Fox News. Let me share just a bit of what Ambassador John Bolton had to say in his previous conversation with the president today. This, again, is part of that coordinated effort by the administration. You have the tweet by the president. You have Mike Pompeo's speech and, of course, his statements. And then this from John Bolton. He said this. I found it fascinating. John Bolton saying, I spoke to the president over the last several days, and President Trump told me that if Iran does anything at all to the negative, they will pay a price like few countries have ever paid before. You may have heard John Decker mention, our radio colleague here at Fox News during the press briefing, that was similar in tone to what the president had to say about the North Korean leadership. Of course, that led to an eventual face-to-face. When asked if there might be a face-to-face in the offing for, say, Iran's leadership, the press secretary punted. John?
She also weighed in on the Russia investigation, Kevin.
Yeah, this is, boy, I tell you what, given everything that we've learned, Tom Fitton's group over there, Judicial Watch, we're learning a great deal. I think the entire American community is learning a great deal about what led up to the eventual Mueller investigation. I tried to ask her about Carter Page and that FISA document, that application, which it has been alleged relied heavily on the so-called Steele dossier, which was, as you remember, funded by the Clinton campaign and the DNC. Here's what Sarah told me not long ago.
The president has purposefully remained uninvolved in this process. He said repeatedly that he wants the Department of Justice to be fully transparent with these requests from Congress, and he's going to continue at this point to remain uninvolved. However, he sees more and more every single day that this is proving further and further to be a total witch hunt, particularly because it was based on a false and unverified and discredited dossier.
John, you may recall that Devin Nunes, a congressman from California, has been very strong in his assertion that the president, that is, should take away all the redactions. If you've seen that document, I mean, it is littered with black ink, if you will, when you print one out. They want to remove a lot of those redactions so the American people, or at a minimum, congressional leaders, can get a look at what actually went down in that FISA application. Very interesting times here at the White House, John.
Indeed. Kevin Korg there at the briefing room. Kevin, thank you. Adam Airley joins us now. He is a former U.S. ambassador to Bahrain and former Deputy State Department spokesman. First of all, the idea that people like Jim Brennan, the former CIA director, keep their security clearances after the White House. Now the White House is threatening to take that away. Is that going to ring alarm bells in Washington, Ambassador?
Well, I think so. I think it'll ring alarm bells among a whole host of senior level civil servants and U.S. government officials. I mean, look, it's not just Brennan. He talked about McCabe. He talked about Comey. These are Republicans as well as Democrats. And I think that we're going down a slippery slope. I mean, who's to decide what's political and what's not political? Who's to decide who gets withdrawn and who doesn't get withdrawn? So, you know, this strikes me as a way of lashing out at the president's critics. But, you know, that's part of the job, is to defend your positions and to explain to the American public why you're right and they're wrong. But attacking them in this way, or going after them in this way, or slanting the playing field in this way, again, seems to me to set a pretty dangerous precedent.
But when a former CIA director comes out and says that the news conference that he held in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin was treasonous, I think was his name, or bordered on treason, that's pretty strong stuff from a guy like Jim Brennan.
It is strong stuff, and I think it might have crossed the line. But what I also think is interesting is he was talking about a public press conference. He wasn't talking about any privileged information, any access to information that he had that other people didn't have. He was talking about what every American saw on television and was voicing his opinion. Why should that encourage retaliation from the President of the United States?
Yeah. Speaking of retaliation, the President seems to be threatening Iran right now in an all-caps tweet. He really went after the mullahs there. What do you make of the threats that the President and, frankly, the Iranians are trading right now?
Well, I think it shows heightening tension between Iran and the rest of the world. I mean, look, let's remember, Iran has been identified by this administration as one of its top foreign policy priorities. They have a history of developing nuclear weapons, of developing ballistic missiles to deliver them, and to undermining our allies in the area. And I think the administration is serious about pushing back against them. They've withdrawn from the JCPOA. We've announced tough sanctions which will take place in November and which will prevent Iran from getting revenue from oil sales. The Secretary of State yesterday said he was the United States supported the Iranian people in their quest for justice against the mullahs. So I think what we're seeing from Iran is basically feeling the pressure. Rouhani, their president, threatened to close the Straits of Hormuz. Hey, let's remember, 20% of the world's oil supply goes to the Straits of Hormuz. The fact that Trump responded that they better be careful if they threaten the United States and international commerce, I think is a threat to be taken seriously, and it was fully warranted.
Could they actually close the straits? That would bring almost immediate military activity from countries like the U.S., would it not?
Yeah, it absolutely would. I mean, like we should all know, the Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain in the Persian Gulf and is there for the precise purpose of keeping open these straits. I think what we're seeing, though, again, is increasing desperation on the part of the regime in Tehran, which faces unprecedented public protests and public dissatisfaction with the clerical rule. The Iranian currency has lost more than almost 100% of its value. It's gone from 30,000 to the dollar to I think about 90,000 to the dollar of the last year or so. So they're in trouble, and they're, I think, trying to bluster their way out of a dead end. But Trump and the U.S. administration are making clear to them there is no way out other than accepting our terms. Now, they can cause problems. They've done it in the past, and they're capable of doing it in the future.
Ambassador Adam Arely, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So Iran responding to President Trump's tweet within hours, state-controlled media calling it a passive reaction to the comments from Iran's president. Senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palcott is following reaction from world leaders live in London. Greg.
Hi, John. In Iran, there was a mixed reaction, some dismissive, some pretty strong against the comments coming from President Trump. Iranian President Rouhani's defense minister saying, this is a quote, that U.S. doesn't understand any other language than force. The head of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran branding the comments, quote, psychological warfare, and saying the U.S. wouldn't dare take action against Iran. Still, another Iran-based analyst simply called the words the storm before the calm, and another noted that the president also talked tough with North Korea before going the diplomatic route. Meanwhile, mixed reaction too globally about how to deal with Iran. A German government official saying that that country supports dialogue, talks, and, quote, rhetorical disarmament. The approach, however, gets approval from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying that this clear position is against Iranian aggression and stands in contrast with years of world powers pampering the Iranian government.
Lawmakers from both parties say it's time to get tougher on Russia to defend our democracy. Chief congressional correspondent Mike Emanuel live on Capitol Hill with that. Mike.
John, good afternoon. Some leading Republicans in the Senate are already calling for the need to enact tougher sanctions as a warning shot to Moscow.
The most important thing I think we need to focus on now is deterring future attacks by putting in place immediate sanctions that take hold if they do this again.
And New Jersey Democrat Senator Bob Menendez is basically calling on President Trump to get personally tough with Vladimir Putin.
I would have liked him to said, look, President Putin, we know that you interfered in our 2016 elections and that you're doing it now. And that's not a question. That's a statement. And here are consequences to it.
So the need for consequences. You have members of both parties very concerned about upcoming elections in this country in less than 4 months. And they want the Russian president to think twice before he even thinks about meddling in those elections as well. John?
What are some of the key takeaways lawmakers are telling you about that they see coming out of the Helsinki summit?
Well, John, a key House Republican says when the leaders of two nuclear superpowers, the U.S. and Russia, actually sit down and talk, well, that's a good thing.
As a diplomat, I'm a believer in dialogue. We dialogue with Russia all through the Cold War. So one thing that came out of Helsinki is the President and Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Bolton have resurrected an architecture that's constructive to continuing dialogue, and that might lead to some opportunities.
A leading House Democrat, a frequent critic of this president, says President Putin won the day.
The talks in Helsinki were productive, but they were productive for Vladimir Putin. The reality is we have no idea what this president, our president, agreed to. That's an asymmetric advantage for the Kremlin because they do. The Kremlin intelligence agents know exactly what took place in that meeting.
That kind of reaction may be why President Trump is eager to host a Trump-Putin Summit 2.0 here in Washington on his home turf. John?
Mike Emanuel at the Capitol. Mike, thank you. We are waiting to hear more from President Trump. We will bring that to you live when it begins. But first, we're now learning there are more tapes by Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen. Now we know exactly how many. That's next. Breaking news. Fox News has learned the feds now have 12 recordings seized from President Trump's former lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen. Last week, we found out the FBI has a tape of Cohen supposedly discussing a payment to a former Playboy model who claimed she had an affair with President Trump years ago. Now we're finding out there are more. Let's bring in Jeffrey Kramer, a former federal prosecutor and assistant U.S. attorney. He's now managing director at Berkeley Research Group. That's a global consulting firm. Jeffrey, the fact that there are 12 recordings, I mean, it sounds ominous, but we don't know what's in them. And until we do, it's kind of meaningless, isn't it?
You're right. It does sound ominous, but 12 is a lot. And if even a small portion are what it could be with respect to the payments to these women, then it could prove to be a problem for Mr. Cohen if he violated campaign election finance, as well as possibly some of the people in the Trump campaign at that point.
Well, is this something that Cohen was doing to try to, insure him as a kind of an insurance policy for the future?
It seems like that's exactly what it was. It's obviously highly unusual for any attorney to tape their client, certainly if that client was Donald Trump. But it is an insurance policy, and now he has something that the government may want, that he can add some color to. But it's important to keep in mind that this could just be the campaign election finance. Not a huge deal in and of itself. The issues could come at the other threads that government could pull, law enforcement could start pulling, and we saw that with the Manafort case. You don't know where it's going to lead.
But the idea that, some former Playboy model wants some money from the guy who's running for president, there's no surprise in that, is there?
No, that's hardly shocking. The problem is if money was paid to either one or two of these women in order to keep it quiet right before the election, that could be seen as an illegal campaign contribution.
Really? Even if it's just, money that makes a problem go away? A lot of candidates spend money to keep stuff out of the headlines, don't they?
Absolutely, but we saw this with other elected officials. If the money is being used to keep it perhaps from your wife, you didn't want your wife to know. That seems to make sense. But if it's kept so it's information that the electorate does not know, in and of itself, it's fine, but you need to list that as a campaign contribution. They obviously didn't do that, and Mr. Cohen seemed to have gone through several machinations of setting up a separate company in Delaware, etc., to keep it hidden from the electorate before the election. That's the problem.
Over the weekend, we saw the release of some of the information, redacted heavily, that led to the FISA court warrants for some of the spying on members of the Trump campaign. The president says it vindicates him, does it?
It really doesn't. And it was a confusing statement. The argument is, at least from the White House, that it's clear that the dossier, the Steele dossier, was the basis for the affidavit. And that is an accurate statement. The part that isn't accurate is that the court was deceived. They didn't know that that dossier was paid for by opponents of Donald Trump. The court did know that. As a matter of fact, if you look at what was revealed, not the redacted portions, but just what's there, there's about a page of footnotes that deal specifically with the potential bias of the Steele dossier. So the court was aware of it. Even though they were aware of that, they still authorized the warrant. That's the important point.
But if the Steele dossier is largely a fabrication, doesn't that, threaten the very subject of this whole FISA business?
If it was the only point, then yes, that's a fair comment. However, with what we see in the affidavit, which is 412 pages when it's all said and done, there were several data points that law enforcement have that were sufficient in and of themselves for this warrant. They included what was in the dossier, but then they also made sure the court knew that there could be some bias with the dossier. Bias is fine. Bias doesn't mean that the information given isn't true, as long as the court is aware of that bias. But there were 4 or 5 other pretty strong points that they had going in. And I think it's important to remember, or to at least know, that getting a warrant, any sort of wiretap, certainly in a FISA court, is not easy. There's many layers that have to be done within a prosecutorial office. Here, the Deputy Attorney General, a Trump appointee, approved it. 4 judges, all Republican appointee, approved it at different points. So the warrant itself, I think, is on firm grounds. Whether or not it reveals anything about Mr. Page being an agent of the Russians, we don't know that yet.
Well, again, it depends on how accurate the information was that those judges saw. Jeffrey Kramer, former federal prosecutor. Thank you.
Certainly.
Breaking news, a live look outside the courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside D.C. Former Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort is getting more time to prepare for his trial on bank and tax fraud charges. It was set to start this week. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is live in Washington with more on the delay. Catherine.
Well, thanks, John. Good afternoon. Manafort's legal team had asked for more time to go through thousands of records, documents related to the case, and the judge in this prosecution, Judge T.S. Ellis in Virginia, has granted them until July 31st, so he's given them about a week of wiggle room. This is the Virginia court is known as the rocket docket. It has a reputation for moving very quickly, so in this case it's not surprising. He's granted an extra bit of time, but only a week, John.
Catherine, thank you. Back to you in a moment. The president speaking now in the White House, a manufacturing event. Let's listen in.
And we can't go the other way, and this is the way it's going to go. Make our farmers great again. So I just had them made up, and that's the way I feel. We'll give them to some of the farmers here. But I want to thank you and welcome everybody to the White House for the second annual Made in America Showcase. Made in America, Made in the USA. What do you like better? Huh? Made in the USA, Made in America? Both pretty good. Both pretty good. I remember when I was growing up, I'd see Made in America all over the place. A little bit Made in the USA, but Made in America. Everything had Made in America. And we're starting that again, and it's happening again, as you know. We're here today to celebrate the greatest products in the world, products made with American heart, American sweat, and American pride. We're thrilled to showcase incredible American-made goods from all 50 states. We have snowboards from Colorado. What is a snowboard person? Those were nice snowboards. 10 years ago, I was perfect. Now, I don't know. I'm not such a beautiful job. Cowboy boots from Texas. Where's cowboy boots? I like those boots. I like those boots. Baseball bats from Pennsylvania. I used to play baseball. Good. Boats, cars, spaceship. You know about the spaceship. And in case you hadn't noticed, there's an F-35 stealth fighter outside, and it's beautiful, parked on the South Lawn. I guess getting it here, I know it didn't land on the South Lawn, but it's something very special. It's can't see it. Where's Lockheed? Maryland, yeah. It's incredible. I went to one of the pilots. I was saying, how do you compare this with a certain other plane from the enemy? They said, well, the difference is when we fight, they can't see our plane. I said, that sounds like a pretty big advantage, right? It's called stealth, super stealth. All of these products have something special, very much in common. A big, beautiful seal, and that's with the sign, in this case, Made in the USA. Also joining us today, and at the event, is NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine. Where's Jim? Jim, thank you. Jim, thank you. And Marilyn, thank you for being here from Lockheed Martin. After many years of decline, American manufacturing is coming back bigger and better and stronger than ever before. It's happening. We're in the midst of a great economic revival in the United States. We've added 3.7 million new jobs since the election, including more than 370,000 in manufacturing alone. Remember during the campaign, they all said, oh, you're never going to add manufacturing jobs. That's obsolete, they would say. I said, it's obsolete? To make things is obsolete? I guess they were wrong, right? I guess they were wrong. We're adding a lot more. Almost 1 million workers discouraged by the policies of the previous administration and, frankly, other administrations have now returned to the workforce. New unemployment claims are at the lowest level in almost half a century. Think of that. The lowest level unemployment claims. That's a big one. Unemployment rates for Americans, for African Americans and Hispanics and Asians. Americans, all of us, lowest ever. These are the lowest levels for African Americans, for Hispanics, and for Asians ever recorded. Think of that, ever recorded. And women, unemployment recently reached the 65-year low. We think that's probably the lowest ever. But as I've been saying, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it will be. It'll be the lowest in history. Pretty bad when you say the lowest in 65 years. And I say that's not as good as history. So, but very shortly it will be. We'll be saying history. Manufacturing wages are expected to rise at the fastest rate in more than 17 years. And 95% of American manufacturers, which I love, that's what we love, is manufacturers, are optimistic about the future. That's the highest level ever recorded, 95%. We have achieved together in the last 18 months something that is totally unprecedented. For decades, the United States allowed other countries to steal our jobs, close our factories, and plunder our wealth. What was happening was horrible. I used to talk about it for 20 years in the private sector. I said, how did they let this happen? Little did I know I'd get my shot. That's what happened. And that's what's happening to us, because it's really been positive. Our leaders in Washington did nothing. They did nothing. They let our factories leave. They let our people lose their jobs, given to other jobs, workers in faraway lands. That's not free trade. That's fool's trade. That's stupid trade. And we don't do that kind of trade anymore. The European Union's been very tough on the United States, but they're coming in to see me on Wednesday. And we'll see if we can work something out. And otherwise, we'll have to do something with respect to the millions of cars that they send in every year. But maybe we can work something out. They're all coming in, the top people. We're talking to China, who had a $375 billion trade surplus last year with the United States. They were $375 billion, or looking at it differently, we had a $375 billion trade deficit. That's not good. And we're talking to China very seriously. We're talking to Mexico on NAFTA. And I think we're going to have something worked out. The new president, terrific person. I spoke to him at length on a call, did a great job, got a tremendous vote, and they have a lot of confidence in him in Mexico, and that's good. But we're talking to them about doing something very dramatic, very positive for both countries. We're demanding fairness with the World Trade Organization. It's been a disaster for the United States, and we want fairness. We'd lose court cases. We always had a minority of judges. They gave us fewer judges than other countries had. And we'd lose cases. Nobody knew why. I said, I know why. Because you don't have judges from this country. You'd have a minority, 3-2, with 3 being on the other side. And we've started to do much better lately in winning cases. But America never waves the white flag. We only wave the red, white, and blue flag. The era of economic surrender for the United States is over. It's over. And you people have been really leading the charge. America's fighting back, and we're winning again. You know my story about winning, we're going to win so much, you'll get tired of winning. I don't think you're going to get tired. Throughout our history, our greatest leaders, Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Lincoln, McKinley. People don't know too much about McKinley. Take a look. It was an really incredible economic time for our country. People wanted to come in and take from our country. They had to pay for it. They had to pay for the privilege of taking from our country. We all understood that to be strong, and every one of them, our nation, that we really had to be a manufacturing nation. You have to be able to be a manufacturing nation. I'm very proud to say that our steel industry is coming back at a level that nobody thought possible. Factories are opening up all over. No matter where I'm going, they're saying, you know, we just opened up a steel plant that was closed for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years in some cases. U.S. Steel now is opening up 6 plants, and they're expanding in other plants. And we're very proud of that. But we were being dumped on. You know what that means? We're being dumped on. They were dumping all over this country. And now our steel industry is coming back. And you need a steel industry. That's not like a normal thing where you make even some of your products, which I love, but it's not steel. We need steel. We need it in case of an emergency of the wrong kind. My administration is reclaiming our proud manufacturing heritage because we are finally putting, again, America first. We're tearing down barriers to our exports, protecting our intellectual property, and defending our companies from unfair foreign trade practices, of which there are many. We're putting the trade cheaters on notice. No one rips off the United States of America anymore. It's happened too much for too long and stopping. To give you a level playing field, we've cut record numbers of regulations. In the history of our country, nobody's cut more regulations than me, and I've only been here for less than 2 years. So I'm talking about 2 years, 4 years, 16 years, 8 years. Doesn't matter how long they're here. We've cut more regulations than any other president, and we've just been here for shorter than 2 years. We passed the biggest tax cut and reform in American history. We've gotten rid of the individual mandate from health care, which was a disaster for you and your businesses, where people had to pay for the privilege of not having to pay to get bad health care. Sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty basic. You pay for not having to buy. And a lot of people wondered about that one. That's gone. That's a big thing. That's gone. That was the most unpopular element of Obamacare, and Obamacare is very rapidly fading away. We had it done, but we missed it by one vote. Somebody changed their mind in the middle of the evening. Wonder who that was. But just one of those things, but we're very far progressed. And we're now opening up health care policies and making it possible for people to buy great health care at a low cost. And we're very proud of that. And it's opened. Secretary of Labor Acosta has done an incredible job. And Secretary Azar is in the process of doing something that's going to be very big. And all of you people will be big beneficiaries of that in the business world also. Since our tax cuts were passed, more than 6 million Americans have received a bonus or a pay raise, in some cases a very substantial bonus, and they're really liking it. Creating over $7 trillion of worth for our country, we vaulted up to a very strong #1 position. We're the largest in the world, largest economy in the world.
All right, the president there saying the era of economic surrender for the United States is over. This is a manufacturing event, his second since he's been president at the White House. The White House lawn is decorated, if you will, with made in America products, including a Never Summer snowboard from my home state of Colorado, and things like an F-35 stealth fighter, also a space capsule. Out there on the lawn of the White House, one item from each manufacturer in each of the 50 states. The president there touting that the steel industry is coming back and saying that African American and Hispanic unemployment in this country is at historic levels. Let's get back to that report from our chief intelligence correspondent, Catherine Herridge. She's live with news that the Paul Manafort trial has been delayed till the end of July. But also, Catherine, wanted to get your take on the White House talking about taking away security clearances from some former officials.
Okay, for some context, many people leave the government with clearances if they leave under good circumstances, like they resign, or if they're a political appointee, they're replaced, and they use that clearance to help with their consultancy work after they leave government. So losing your clearance really dings your ability to earn money after you've left the government. You know, by example, when FBI lawyer Lisa Page and Agent Peter Strzok left the FBI or were forced out of the FBI, they lost their clearances as well, which had to be restored in order for them to give those depositions in a closed session to the two House committees. The other thing that I would say is that we're really in uncharted territory, because in the 17 years that I've covered the intelligence community here in Washington, I've never seen a group of former intelligence officials be so public, so open in their political views after they have left office. Typically, people go sort of quietly into the night to retirement or to do consultancy work, but maybe it's the impact of social media, the impact of Twitter, or the lure of working as TV pundits, if you will. will, as specialists in this area, but I haven't really seen a group as so outspoken in public about their political views as we have during the last couple of years. But many things, as you know, have been unprecedented since this president took office, John.
Well, let's talk about some of the names here. John Brennan, the former director of the CIA, Jim Comey, the former FBI director, Clapper, the former director of national intelligence, James Clapper, and Susan Rice, President Obama's national security advisor for a time. There are a couple of others on the list as well. Is it possible? I mean, is it possible to characterize this as anything other than, you know, a kind of a brushback by the White House, or are there, you know, is there more than revenge at work here?
Well, I don't think it's my position really to speculate on whether it was appropriate or whether it amounted to retaliation. But what I can tell you in a very factual way is that I cannot remember a time when former senior intelligence officials have been so open in public about their political views that relate to ongoing investigations. In this case, the Russia case. Of the group that was mentioned by Sarah Sanders at the podium, the one that is kind of not like the others, which doesn't seem to fit, is Susan Rice. Susan Rice has not really been leaning forward in the same way the others have in terms of television appearances or the messages in which she has communicated her political views on developments on Twitter. Just, you know, it's important to note that it was after Helsinki that the former CIA director John Brennan very publicly on Twitter said that this was treasonous behavior. I think those were close to his words. And then he repeated the same claims on television. So there was really no mystery as to where he stood on that news conference and the president's decision making.
That said, Susan Rice was heavily involved in the unmasking of names that is part of this FISA warrant thing that is so bubbling through Washington right now.
She was, and she has argued in testimony on the Hill that this was part of her job and that she had deep concerns about some of these Russian contacts or associated contacts leading up to the campaign. Her personal feelings on that, though, she has not broadcast on Twitter, at least not to my knowledge, John.
Catherine Herridge, good reporting as always. We appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Back to President Trump's tough talk on Iran. President moments ago asked if he is concerned about provoking tensions with that country. His response next. President Trump issues a threat to Iran. It's not the first time he's talked tough like this. Last year, President Trump threatened North Korea with fire and fury, but ended up having a summit with Kim Jong-un. Today, the White House would not say whether President Trump would be open to meeting Iran's leader. The Fox Business Network's Christina Partsenevelos is live at the White House for us now. Christina.
Right, and just moments ago when President Trump was giving a tour on the front lawn, he was asked specifically about the tensions with Iran and if he was concerned about it, and he said, I quote, "Not at all." He is not at all concerned with the escalating tensions between both countries. And what do I mean by escalating tensions? You have Iran, the president of Iran, just on Sunday, yesterday, putting out a speech stating that, if anything, Iran is the mother of all peace, and war with Iran is the mother of all wars. So you had President Trump that responded to that in a tweet in all capital letters, which we understand as to be yelling in the online world. And let's get to that tweet. Trump tweeted exactly that: "Never, ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the like of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We are no longer a country that will stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious." His tweet was further reinforced by Mike Pompeo, who spoke yesterday at an event in Washington. Mike Pompeo it's pretty much said that, if anything, Iran is run by the mafia and there's corruption within the economy there. Then this morning you had comments from Bolton, the National Security Advisor, John Bolton. He said that Iran, or any country that essentially reacts negatively to the United States, will pay a price. Those words are also reflected with Sarah Sanders, press secretary. She spoke earlier in a press briefing, and she also said that the tensions have escalated, but that they're still trying to mitigate it. And I think right before you threw to me, you were talking about whether Iran and the United States will ever have a chance to meet. About a month ago, the president said he's still waiting for a phone call from Iran to make a deal, and maybe they can make a deal. Iran media, though, is stating that they're not looking to meet the United States.
And the Iranian response to the president has been to sort of poo-poo and maybe even belittle what he has had to say.
Exactly. They have their state media over there, and within the last 24 hours, they've pretty much said, hey, you know, this is no big deal. We are going to go about our business. However, if you speak to Iranian people, and this is being covered by the international press, they're worried because the economy is being hit. You have the United States in May that pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Then the United States also put forward or proposed several economic sanctions. This is hurting the Iranian economy. And then so you have Iran that's retaliating, saying that we will close off the Strait of Hormuz if you decide to play war with us. And so why that certain area? Because a lot of oil passes through that canal, and if they cut it off, that could deplete a lot of the supply of oil around the globe. Just because of these talks, you've seen the price of oil as climbed very high, well above $70 U.S. a barrel just over a little while. So it's had a ripple effect across the entire globe when it comes to the price of oil. And when the price of oil is higher, that means it's more expensive for companies. So there's a lot of back and forth between both countries, and still no conclusion as to whether they're going to discuss a deal, talk about improving the economic situation, but you just have tweets for the moment.
Christina Partsenevelos, Fox Business Network there at the White House. Christina, thank you. So coming up, we're going to examine what appear to be some threats from the White House to revoke the security clearances of former officials, primarily from the Obama administration. We'll talk about it with a former Bush White House personnel member right after this. All right after this show, you can catch me on Facebook Watch for a Fox News update. Want to tell you about the situation that we just heard from Sarah Sanders, the White House press secretary, who says that the White House is considering revoking the security clearances of several members of the Obama administration and others, including former CIA director, as well as John Brennan, as well as James Clapper, the former director of national intelligence. Let's talk about it with Teresa Payton. She was the White House chief information officer under President George W. Bush, now CEO of Fortalice Solutions, which helps protect businesses and government agencies from cyber attacks. Teresa, the idea that the White House would revoke those security clearances, or might, how does that strike you?
Well, it's one of those things where obviously if you're not still working on a classified program, you get read off, and that's a procedure that's done. But these particular individuals, they've been on the front lines of the global cyber war. They speak from experience, and at this point, I just don't feel like we can afford to lose their institutional knowledge, especially at this time where Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea are all flexing their cyber muscles in different ways. So we definitely need to make sure we're able to keep their institutional knowledge, the fact that they know who to call, they know from experience, from mistakes made, for things that went right, how to handle these tough situations.
In short, you think it would be a bad idea to revoke their clearances?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should look at sort of the knowledge that they have, what they have to offer, keep their clearances intact, and tap into them on sort of that need-to-know basis.
But the idea that they've been out there criticizing the president or criticizing the White House, using, some of the information that they may have developed from their clearances as a result of their clearances, that doesn't sit too well with President Trump.
And I can understand him feeling that way, but, sometimes the best cybersecurity policy and countermeasures we've come up with in this country were based on having healthy levels of disagreement around how to go about executing actions and countermeasures based on the intelligence gathered. And so this is the time that we should be, even if there's disagreement and an agreement to disagree, we should be hearing all different points of view and considering those. And so I could see where he would feel like them criticizing his policy is not helpful, but we need to continue to have a dialogue about why do they feel the way that they do, and turn their intellect and their experiences into the action plans and the countermeasures this country desperately needs.
Teresa Payton, CEO at Fortalice Solutions, formerly with the Bush White House. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome. That's going to do it for today. I'm John Scott, in for Shepard Smith. We'll continue to keep an eye on this threat, if you will, from the White House to revoke the security clearances Of those 6 people whose names and faces you just saw on the screen, many of them worked in the Obama White House, some in the Bush White House. Your World with Neil Cavuto is next.